Drive this F1 car, and I'll marry you." The billionaire's voice cut through the luxury air of the Monaco hangar like a blade. Guests froze, then burst into laughter, their jeweled glasses trembling in their hands. The target of his mockery, a young maid named Mia, stood motionless beside the black car, her eyes wide and silent. Only the hum of engines waiting outside broke the cruelty of the moment. Charles Rowan adjusted his cufflinks, pretending not to notice the tremor in her hands. "Come now," he added with a grin. "It's just a joke. You wouldn't even know where the ignition is." His friends chuckled. The cameras flashed. The girl in the red uniform seemed swallowed by the brilliance around her, silk, metal, and arrogance. Mia's fingers tightened around the tray she was holding. She hadn't meant to brush against the car. A single drop of champagne had rolled off a glass and fallen near its tire, enough to summon his scorn. Her cheeks burned, but her eyes didn't lower. Somewhere in her chest, a small, defiant rhythm began to beat. The sound of laughter filled the hangar, echoing off the glass walls. Charles basked in it, turning to the crowd like an actor playing a scene he'd rehearsed 100 times. "Imagine it," he said. "The Maid of Monaco behind the wheel." The line earned applause, but beneath the laughter, the silence of one person grew louder. Mia set the tray down carefully, as if time itself had slowed. Her heart pounded, but her expression softened into something almost serene. She looked at the car, its sleek red curves, the silent power it carried, and for a fleeting second, the noise around her faded. It felt like seeing an old friend across a crowd. Charles noticed the shift. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone suddenly less confident. "Lost your words." He meant it to sting, but it didn't. Her silence unnerved him. The air thickened. Somewhere near the car's rear tire, a drop of champagne reflected the lights like a tear refusing to fall. When Mia finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "No, Mr. Rowan," she said. "I'm just wondering what makes a man think courage is measured by mockery." Her tone was calm, not bitter, and that calmness was worse than any insult. Even the guests, unsure how to react, fell quiet. He laughed again, but it sounded forced this time, too sharp to be natural. "Don't take it personally," he muttered, glancing away. But the rhythm of the room had changed. The laughter had died too soon. For a man used to control, that silence felt like losing traction on wet asphalt. Mia turned and began to walk away, her shoes clicking softly against the concrete. For a brief moment, Charles watched her reflection glide over the F1 car's polished surface. There was something about her composure that unsettled him, a stillness that hinted at something hidden, something beyond servitude. And though he didn't know it yet, that careless challenge, "Drive this car, and I'll marry you," had just awakened a past he couldn't imagine, and a destiny he wouldn't be able to outrun. When the laughter finally faded, it left a void so deep that even the sound of engines outside seemed distant. Mia stood alone near the corridor door, her breath trembling, as if afraid to break the quiet. Behind her, voices resumed, softer now, uncertain, trying to pretend nothing had happened. But humiliation had its own echo, and it followed her like a shadow. She pushed open the heavy metal door leading to the service hallway. The air changed, colder, real, stripped of perfume and applause. Here, there were no billionaires or bright lights, only the faint buzz of fluorescent bulbs and the smell of oil. Mia's reflection on the narrow window looked unfamiliar, almost like a stranger's. Her hands shook as she set the empty tray down on a counter. The laughter replayed in her head, each note sharper than before. She closed her eyes, but the image of Charles's smirk wouldn't fade. His words, "Drive this F1 car and I'll marry you," clung to her like a cruel melody she couldn't stop hearing. She had endured mockery before. It came with the uniform, with the quiet work of being invisible among people who never looked twice. But something about tonight felt different. It wasn't just the insult. It was the way the car had looked at her, gleaming under the light, like it remembered her too. A gust of wind seeped through the open window, carrying the distant hum of engines being tested outside. It was the same sound she used to fall asleep to years ago when her father worked nights at the small racing circuit on the outskirts of Marseille. That hum had always meant hope. Now it sounded like a calling. Mia walked toward the window, the city of Monaco glowing beyond the track. She could still hear the faint laughter of the guests echoing through the hangar, muffled now by distance. She pressed her palm to the glass, watching her breath fog it slightly. For a second, the reflection of the car seemed to appear again behind her eyes. She whispered to herself, "Don't let them take this from you again." The words surprised her. They came out steadier than she expected. For a woman used to silence, it was strange how much strength could hide inside a whisper. The moment stretched, suspended between shame and awakening. Footsteps approached behind her. Another maid, younger, nervous. "Mia, are you all right?" she asked softly. Mia turned, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice carried the quiet weight of something breaking open inside. "It's just noise. It will fade." But she knew it wouldn't. As the girl left, Mia stood alone once more, gazing toward the hangar doors. The laughter had long ended, yet she could still feel its rhythm in her chest, pushing against something stronger: pride, memory, fire. Somewhere deep down, she knew this silence was not weakness. It was gathering strength, and as the night deepened around her, the same thought began to return, steady and dangerous. He said, "Drive this car." And maybe she would. Long before the laughter of strangers filled her nights, there had been the roar of engines and the smell of burnt rubber. Mia's world once spun around a small racetrack on the outskirts of Marseille, where mornings began with her father's whistle and the metallic hum of wrenches turning in rhythm. She was 16, wild-eyed and fast, the kind of girl who believed destiny could be chased if you pressed the pedal hard enough. Her father, André, used to say, "A car doesn't obey strength, only respect." She listened to every word as though it were scripture. Together, they built an old cart from spare parts and dreams. It rattled, it coughed, it flew, and when she drove, the wind didn't just rush past her. It lifted her. Those were the golden years. Every weekend, the stands filled with locals cheering for the mechanic's daughter who raced like a storm. She wasn't rich, but on that track, she was untouchable. Her name, Mia Laurent, began to appear on small posters and amateur magazines. The world, for a while, seemed willing to open its gates. But life has a way of testing the ones who dream too brightly. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, her father collapsed beside the car, a wrench still in his hand. The doctors called it a heart attack. The bills came faster than condolences. The track, the tools, even the cart, all were sold to pay for what couldn't be saved. The following months were a blur of hospital corridors and unpaid rent. Mia stopped racing, stopped smiling, and finally stopped believing that the world remembered her name. She found work cleaning hotel rooms, then kitchens, then mansions, anywhere silence was part of the uniform. Racing became a ghost she avoided looking at directly. Still, every time an engine roared in the distance, something in her stirred. It was faint at first, like hearing a song she used to love but had forgotten the lyrics too. Her hands would tighten on the mop handle, mimicking the grip of a steering wheel she no longer had. Memories refused to stay buried. One night, she walked to the seaside and sat watching the reflection of city lights trembling on the waves. She thought of her father's voice, calm and certain, "Respect the car, and it will show you who you are." The words no longer brought comfort. They brought ache. Because she knew who she was. She just buried it under years of silence. When she later moved to Monaco to work for the Rowans' luxury estate, she told herself it was just another job. She avoided the racing posters on the walls, the trophies in glass cases, the sound of engines roaring outside. But the irony wasn't lost on her. Fate, it seemed, enjoyed cruel humor. Every morning as she cleaned the billionaire's cars, she caught her reflection in their polished surfaces, a reminder of the girl she once was. The girl who dreamed of speed and light, now reduced to wiping the dust off someone else's machine. Each reflection felt like a quiet accusation she couldn't answer, and that was the life she had accepted. Until the day a single drop of champagne fell near a black F1 tire, and a stranger's laughter cracked the silence wide open. The morning after the humiliation, the world outside looked the same. Golden sun, sea breeze, and the distant roar of engines warming up. But something inside Mia had shifted. The laughter still echoed in her mind, but now it came with another sound, layered beneath it, the deep, steady growl of an engine she could almost feel beneath her skin. She walked past the hangar again, head lowered, pretending not to look. The F1 car was still there, a scarlet monument under the lights. The billionaire wasn't around. Only a few mechanics worked in silence, adjusting gears and polishing chrome. One of them, an older man with grease-stained hands, glanced at her and smiled faintly. "You were brave yesterday," he murmured without looking up. His accent carried the roughness of years spent on the track. Mia blinked, unsure how to respond. "Brave?" she asked softly. He nodded. "To stand there and not run. Most would have." Then he handed her a rag and gestured toward the car. "Want to help me clean her?" For a moment the air stopped moving. Her fingers hovered above the rag, above that gleaming red machine that had once been a symbol of her humiliation. Then, slowly, she took it. The cloth brushed against the car's smooth surface, and the sensation was electric. It wasn't a car anymore. It was memory. The mechanic's name was René. He didn't ask questions, and she didn't offer answers. They worked in silence, but something about that silence was alive. When she looked at the steering wheel, her pulse quickened. It was almost identical to the one she'd trained with years ago. Every button, every curve a map her hands already knew. René noticed her gaze. "You've driven before," he said quietly. She froze. It was a long time ago," she replied. He smiled, not in disbelief, but in recognition. "Doesn't matter, some things don't fade." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The key's in the ignition. If you ever want to remember who you are, the car won't stop you." Mia laughed softly, but her laughter was thin, nervous. Still, the thought lodged itself deep inside her mind. That night, long after everyone had left, she found herself standing at the edge of the hangar again. The car waited beneath the dim lights, red and patient, like a heart still beating for her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. The scent of fuel and steel filled her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The silence of the night pressed close, heavy, with unspoken promises. All it would take was one motion, one breath, and she could wake the past. She didn't start the engine that night, not yet. But when she walked away, she carried its echo inside her, the whisper of power waiting to be claimed. For the first time since her father's death, the road didn't feel closed anymore. It felt like it was waiting for her return. And somewhere in the shadows, René watched her leave with a knowing look. Because he'd seen that kind of fire before, the kind that either breaks a person or makes them unstoppable. If this moment made your heart race, leave A in the comments, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and redemption. The night was heavy with the scent of rain and motor oil. Clouds gathered above the Monaco circuit like silent witnesses, hiding the stars that once guided her father's nights. Mia stood in the shadows near the hangar, her heart thundering louder than the distant waves. Every rational thought begged her to turn back, but pride had already taken the wheel. The car gleamed under the emergency lights, still immaculate, still untouchable. Her reflection shimmered on its red surface, like a ghost testing her resolve. "Just to feel it again," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft hum of the generators. One step, then another. Her shoes echoed in the emptiness. Each sound felt like defiance. She remembered René's words, "The car won't stop you." They had replayed in her mind all day like a forbidden melody. Now they guided her hands to the driver's door. Her pulse raced as her fingers found the handle, the same kind of door she'd opened 1,000 times in her youth. Yet tonight it felt heavier, sacred, as if crossing it would mean breaking a spell. When she slid into the seat, the leather embraced her like memory itself. Her hands found the steering wheel naturally, her fingers tracing the buttons she didn't need to look at to know. For a moment she closed her eyes. She could almost hear her father's voice, calm and proud, saying, "Respect it and it will answer you." The silence answered first. Her breath deepened. The key was already there. René hadn't lied. She turned it halfway, and the dashboard lit up in a cascade of color. Red, yellow, green. Her reflection in the glass visor of the helmet beside her looked like another person. "You remember," she whispered to herself. "You never forgot." But before she could take the final breath, a flash of red light sliced through the darkness. The alarm. A siren blared across the hangar, violent and shrill, scattering her thoughts like debris. Panic surged. Her hand slammed the key back, silencing the car, but it was too late. Footsteps thundered behind her. Two security guards burst through the doors, their flashlights cutting through the dark. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" one shouted. Mia froze, her body rigid with fear, her heart caught between shame and adrenaline. She stammered, I was just cleaning." But the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Cleaning at midnight?" one of them mocked, grabbing her arm roughly. "You think you belong in that seat?" Their laughter echoed the billionaires from the night before. It cut deeper this time, not because of their words, but because of how familiar they sounded. For a moment she wanted to disappear, but humiliation was no longer enough to break her. As they dragged her toward the exit, a faint voice from the shadows interrupted. "Let her go." It was René, stepping out from behind a stack of tires. His tone carried quiet authority, the kind only earned from decades around engines and prideful men. The guards hesitated, confused. "She's with me," he lied smoothly. "I told her to check the wiring." The men exchanged skeptical looks, but finally released her. Mia's wrist throbbed where they had gripped it, yet her heart beat stronger than ever. As they left, René met her gaze and whispered, "Next time, don't get caught." She wanted to thank him, but her throat was tight. For the first time, someone hadn't mocked her. They'd covered for her. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake in her small apartment, the smell of fuel still clinging to her hands, the sound of the sirens still echoing in her mind. Yet beneath it all, a strange calm settled. Because even failure had felt alive. And that meant one thing. She was back on the track, even if the world didn't know it yet. The next morning arrived wrapped in gold light, but it felt colder than any dawn before. Mia reported for duty as usual, her hair tied neatly, her eyes quiet but unreadable. Whispers followed her down the hallways. The guards had talked. In the mansion's kitchen, even silence felt sharp. Everyone knew, and everyone pretended not to. By noon, she was summoned to the terrace overlooking the bay. Charles Rowan waited there, dressed in white linen and wearing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "So," he began, swirling his champagne, "my staff tells me you've developed an interest in my car." Ambitious, isn't it? His tone was calm, but the words carried that same thread of cruelty she'd come to recognize. Mia kept her hands folded in front of her apron. "I was just cleaning, sir," she said softly, her gaze steady, "like I always do." Charles chuckled, taking a sip before setting the glass down. "At midnight? Alone? You must think I'm naive." His smile grew thin. "Or perhaps you think you're more than you are." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Behind him, the blue of the Mediterranean sparkled against the sunlight, dazzling and cruel in its beauty. Mia felt the burn in her chest again, that same ache that came from swallowing pride. But this time, she didn't lower her eyes. "I don't think I'm more than I am," she said, "but I don't think you know what I am either." For a moment, his expression faltered, just a flicker, like a reflection caught in broken glass. "Careful," he warned, the charm fading from his voice. "I don't appreciate insolence." Mia tilted her head slightly, her voice still calm. "And I don't appreciate cruelty disguised as humor." The words landed softly, but they hit harder than she intended. A long silence stretched between them. The wind tugged at the edge of the tablecloth, and somewhere below, a gull cried over the waves. Charles leaned back, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied. "A man who mistakes wealth for worth." He rose abruptly, the chair scraping against the tiles. For a heartbeat, she thought he might fire her on the spot. Instead, he laughed, not with amusement, but disbelief. "You really are something, aren't you?" he muttered. "I'll give you that." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But don't let that courage fool you. In my world, pride is a dangerous fuel." Mia met his eyes without fear. "And in mine," she said, "so is silence." The words came like a quiet storm, measured, deliberate, final. She turned and began to leave, her steps steady against the marble. Charles stood there, watching her go, unsure whether he'd just been challenged or forgiven. As she disappeared into the long corridor, something strange stirred in him, a discomfort he couldn't name. It wasn't anger, it was curiosity, the kind that grows like a hairline crack in glass, small at first, then impossible to ignore. For the first time, he wanted to know who she really was. Behind her, the ocean glimmered like polished metal, and the reflection of the F1 car flickered through his mind. Somewhere, beneath all his arrogance, Charles felt the weight of his own pride pressing against him, heavier than any car he'd ever driven. That night he couldn't sleep, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing beside the car, calm, unbroken, and hauntingly familiar. The letter arrived in the afternoon, folded neatly without apology. Mia found it on the kitchen counter, her name written in elegant handwriting she recognized too well. Termination of employment. No reason given, no discussion, just a signature. Charles Rowan. The paper trembled in her hands, but she didn't, not this time. The other staff avoided her eyes as she packed. A few offered murmured condolences that meant nothing. She smiled politely, thanked them, and folded her uniform with precision, as though the act of control could soften the truth. Every thread of that uniform had carried humiliation, and yet, somehow, she felt strangely free removing it. She walked through the mansion's corridor one last time. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, lighting up the trophies and photographs of Charles beside his cars. There he was, shaking hands, smiling under spotlights, the king of a world that applauded arrogance. Mia paused only once, in front of a photo of him as a younger man next to a race car, the same model she had once trained on. In the staff locker room, she opened her small wooden cabinet. Inside were a few folded clothes, a worn notebook, and something wrapped in an old cloth. She froze as her fingers brushed the object. When she unwrapped it, dust shimmered into the air, the faint smell of oil and time, her father's racing helmet. The paint had faded and the visor was scratched, but his name was still there. André Laurent, written in bold white letters across the front. Her breath hitched. She remembered the last day she'd worn it, when he'd whispered, "You don't need the world's permission to race. Only your own." She had forgotten those words. Until now. Tears blurred her vision, but behind them came something steadier. Fire, the humiliation, the laughter, the pity. They all fell away, replaced by a single sharp memory of who she had been. She held the helmet close, her pulse sinking with the heartbeat she'd buried for years. The past wasn't gone, it had been waiting. Outside, the sky had turned the color of steel. She stepped into the street, the sea wind whipping her hair as if urging her forward. Each step toward the bus stop felt heavier, slower, not from defeat but from decision. The city lights flickered in the distance, echoing like signals on a track. She didn't go home. Instead, her path curved back toward the circuit. The gates were locked, the world asleep, but she didn't need entry to see it. The hangar, the car, the echo of her father's voice. She stood outside the fence, gripping the metal bars. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Inside her chest, the old rhythm returned, clutch, brake, throttle, heartbeat. The sound of an engine roared again in her mind, drowning out the echo of Charles's laughter. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal fence and whispered, "You shouldn't have challenged me." The wind carried the words away like a vow, and as the moon broke through the clouds, she made her decision. Tomorrow night, she would return to the track, not as a maid, not as a memory, but as the racer she was born to be. In the darkness, she lifted the helmet and slipped it on. The visor clicked shut, with a sound that echoed like destiny locking into place. The circuit lay deserted beneath the moonlight, a serpent of silver cutting through the hills. Every gate was locked, every camera asleep. Yet Mia stood there at the edge of the track, the old helmet in her hands, the cool night air pressing against her skin. The silence was so deep it felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath the ground. She climbed the fence with care, landing softly on the other side. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes, the smell of asphalt and sea salt blending in the wind. For a moment she just stood there, her breath visible in the cold. The vast emptiness of the track stretched before her, endless, waiting, familiar. When she stepped onto the tarmac, the world seemed to vanish. No laughter, no eyes, no expectations. Only the faint whisper of the ocean beyond the stands and the hum of distant lights. She closed her eyes and listened, to the night, to the ghosts of engines, to the echo of her father's voice buried somewhere in the dark. "You're not racing against others," he had once said. "You're racing against the part of yourself that wants to give up." Those words lingered now, fragile but unbroken. She knelt, pressing her palm against the track. It was cold, rough, alive. She could almost feel the vibration of wheels that weren't there. The stars above shimmered faintly, half hidden by clouds. Mia tilted her head upward, the helmet dangling from her hand. "I wish you could see me, Papa," she whispered. "I wish you could tell me if this is madness or faith." The wind didn't answer, only brushed her hair across her face like a father's unseen hand. She walked along the pit lane, tracing her fingers over the empty barriers. Everything smelled of oil and old victories. It was strange, being surrounded by so much power in silence, but instead of fear, she felt something else, belonging. This place had never rejected her. The world had, the track never had. She stopped beside the black F1 car. Renee had left it there, untouched, as if expecting her return. Moonlight painted its curves in silver and shadow. Mia ran her fingertips along the hood. "We meet again," she murmured. The machine didn't answer, but the air around it seemed to hold its breath. Her reflection glimmered in the car's body, no longer a maid, no longer a child, but something in between, unfinished, unbroken. She placed the helmet over her head, feeling the soft click of the visor sealing her from the world. Inside, her breathing grew louder, steadier. For the first time, she didn't feel small, but as her hand reached toward the ignition, doubt clawed its way up her throat. What if the years had taken everything? What if the skill, the instinct, the courage, all of it, was gone? She froze, torn between the hunger to move and the terror of failure. The night seemed to wait for her answer. Then, through the silence, a sound, faint but unmistakable. The soft crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned, her heart pounding. Someone was there, half hidden by the shadows near the stands, watching. A familiar voice drifted through the dark. "I told you the car wouldn't stop you." René stepped into the moonlight, the wind tugging at his jacket. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, though his voice lacked reproach. Mia lowered the helmet's visor, her breath fogging the glass. "Neither should you," she answered. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, two souls drawn to the same forbidden flame. He sighed, walking closer. "You're shaking," he murmured. "Not from fear," she said. "From remembering." That answer made him smile faintly. "Then remember well." With a slow nod, he leaned over and turned the key. The engine growled to life, low and powerful, echoing through the empty stands like a promise fulfilled. Mia's heart surged with it. The vibration crawled up her spine, flooding her veins with something more potent than adrenaline. Belonging. The steering wheel felt natural beneath her hands, the pedals an extension of her thoughts. The years fell away like dust shaken off an old dream. René stepped back, raising his voice over the rising thunder. "Easy on the first turn. She's lighter than you think." Mia gave a single nod, eyes fixed ahead. The smell of fuel, the hum of the tires, the shimmer of the lights on the track, all of it felt like coming home. She pressed the accelerator gently, the car gliding forward, then faster. The air rushed around her, the barriers blurred, and her heartbeat synced with the roar of the machine. Every movement was instinct, no hesitation, no fear, only rhythm, the same rhythm her father had taught her long ago. With each lap, the doubts peeled away. She leaned into the corners, her body flowing with the car, guided by memory and pulse. The track, the moon, the night, all merged into one continuous motion. It wasn't escape, it was reclamation. Mia wasn't running from the past, she was catching it. René watched in awe, his eyes reflecting the blur of red and silver streaking across the straight. He hadn't seen a drive like that in decades. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, reaching for his phone. With trembling hands he began to record. The sound, the speed, the grace. The world needed to see this. The car roared through the final curve, smooth and fierce. Mia didn't care about time or technique, she only cared about that moment. The silence between gear shifts, the way the engine answered her heartbeat. For the first time since her father's death, she felt seen, even if no one else was watching. When she finally stopped, the engine still hummed softly, as if unwilling to rest. She lifted the visor, sweat glistening on her brow, and laughed, not with joy but disbelief. The track was silent again, but the silence felt different now. Not empty, full. From the shadows, René lowered his phone. "You just reminded the night what beauty looks like," he said. Mia smiled, her chest rising with slow, trembling breaths. "No," she whispered. "I just remembered who I am." By sunrise, the video would spread across Monaco, a mystery woman in a maid's uniform driving like a legend reborn. Dawn arrived slowly over Monaco, like light filtering through silk. The sky turned pale gold, the sea whispering beneath the cliffs, and the city began to stir with the hum of luxury and gossip. In a small apartment above a bakery, Mia sat by her open window, the smell of bread mingling with the faint trace of engine oil still clinging to her hands. The helmet lay beside her, glinting faintly in the morning sun, her father's name half faded, but now alive again. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the car breathing beneath her fingertips. Across town, the world was already awake for her. Screens flickered with the same shaky footage. A lone woman in a maid's uniform, driving a Formula One car like she was born to it. The video was grainy, caught in moonlight and shadow, but what it showed was undeniable. The turns were flawless, the control was artistry. The impossible had happened, and the city couldn't stop watching. Monaco, the land of champions, suddenly had a ghost racer. Charles Rowan's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since sunrise. Reporters, sponsors, even friends, all sending the same link. Half asleep, he rubbed his eyes, annoyed, until one headline made him sit upright. Mysterious woman outsmarts billionaire in midnight F1 run. He pressed play, and the room filled with the roar of his own engine. The sound pierced through his chest. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. The figure on screen moved like memory, steady, fearless, deliberate. Not reckless like a thief, but precise like a professional. Her body shifted with each curve, her timing perfect, her exit smooth. The camera shook, but her control never faltered. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance. It was instinct honed through years of devotion. And something about that grace, that quiet mastery, unsettled him more than any insult ever could. He watched again, leaning forward, his reflection faintly mirrored on the tablet's glass. He knew that technique. The delayed braking, the subtle steering correction. It was identical to the style of his late mentor, André Laurent, the man who'd taught him everything about balance and humility behind the wheel. His heart skipped. That couldn't be coincidence. But then, as the visor lifted, he caught a glimpse, a woman's face, half lit by moonlight, half shadowed by destiny. Down at the docks, the video played on every mechanic's phone. Men who once laughed at the billionaire's arrogance now spoke with awe. "Whoever she is, she drove like the old masters," one murmured. "Better," said another. René sat quietly at a corner cafe, a small cup of coffee cooling beside him. He watched the clip not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something he'd always believed, that talent doesn't die. It hides until it's needed again. His lips curved into a proud, secret smile. Meanwhile, Mia walked through the morning crowd, the world unknowingly buzzing around her name. Her steps were light, yet her chest heavy with unspoken questions. She passed a newspaper stand and froze. Her reflection stared back from a glossy front page, the unknown angel of the track. Beneath it, a blurred image of her gloved hand gripping the steering wheel. She felt exposed, fragile, and strangely invincible. She carried her bread and coffee to a quiet bench overlooking the harbour. The water shimmered beneath the rising sun, indifferent to fame or shame. Voices drifted from passers-by. It had to be a professional stunt. No, she drove like someone who's lived it. Who would risk it just for pride? Each speculation was a mirror of her own inner storm. For the first time, she wasn't invisible, but the truth still chained her silence. In his penthouse above the harbour, Charles poured himself a drink far too early for decency. The amber liquid caught the light like guilt. He leaned against the glass wall, eyes fixed on the skyline that had once made him feel untouchable. But now all he could see was her, the maid who had faced his cruelty without flinching, and now, possibly, the same woman who drove like his late teacher's ghost. The weight in his chest felt like something cracking, slow and dangerous. He played the video once more, slowed it, studied every movement, every flick of the wrist, every breath. The truth crept over him like a shadow, terrifying, undeniable, beautiful. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "It's her." He set down his glass, the sound of it echoing through the empty apartment. Then he picked up his phone. "Find her," he said to his assistant. "Whoever she is, I want her name. Now." Across the city, as Charles's search began, Mia sat by the water, eyes closed, face turned to the wind, unaware that the man who had once mocked her was now chasing her truth. The morning sun filtered through the tinted glass of Rowan Motor's top floor, cutting thin golden lines across the marble floor. The city outside moved with its usual rhythm of wealth and indifference, but inside, everything was still. Charles stood by the window, staring out over the bay, as if the horizon could offer him forgiveness. His reflection looked older today, not from time, but from truth catching up to him. The night's obsession had left traces under his eyes, dark as regret. On his desk lay 100 printed stills from the viral video, her eyes, her stance, her control. Every frame whispered the same impossible name. When his assistant entered, the air seemed to change. She moved cautiously, a thin folder clutched to her chest. "Sir," she said quietly, "we found her." Charles didn't turn right away. His fingers tightened slightly against the glass. "Her name?" he asked, voice low. "Mia Laurent," she replied. "She was part of your domestic staff in Monaco." The world seemed to tilt. "Laurent?" he repeated, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes, sir. The daughter of André Laurent, your former mentor." Silence followed. Not the silence of disbelief, but the kind that arrives when the impossible becomes undeniable. He dismissed her with a nod and sank into the leather chair behind his desk. His hands trembled as he opened the folder, revealing a small dossier, employment history, a faded ID photo, and a note in his own handwriting authorizing her hire months ago. He stared at it, hollow. Laurent. The name that had built him, shaped him, saved him, and now, humiliated by his own cruelty, had come back in the form of a woman he'd mocked in front of the world. His pulse thudded in his ears. Every lesson André had ever taught him replayed with unbearable clarity. He remembered the smell of the Marseille workshop, oil, sea salt, and rain-soaked metal, the rhythmic sound of a wrench tightening bolts, while a young, impatient Charles fumbled with the basics. "You're not fighting the car," André had said. "You're fighting your pride." Those words had been a warning then, dismissed with youthful arrogance. Now they felt like prophecy. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, Charles prayed. Not for success, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to undo what he'd broken. Meanwhile, far from the glass towers and mirrored offices, Mia walked through the ruins of her childhood. The old racing academy still stood at the city's edge, half swallowed by weeds and rust. She pushed open the gate, its squeal familiar, haunting, and stepped into what remained of her past. The air was thick with dust and memory. Faded banners fluttered weakly on broken poles bearing her father's name. She smiled faintly through the ache. Laurent Racing Academy, once a place of dreams, now a mausoleum of forgotten victories. Inside the workshop, sunlight spilled through shattered windows, catching motes of dust that floated like spirits. The smell was the same. Oil, rust, faint tobacco. On a workbench, tools lay exactly where her father had left them, preserved in stillness. Mia brushed her fingertips across the initials AL, carved deep into the wood. "You taught him too," she murmured softly. "You taught the man who mocked me how to be better." He just forgot. Her voice didn't shake. It carried acceptance, not bitterness, as if saying it out loud released something long held inside. Outside, an engine idled. The sound was too clean, too deliberate to be coincidence. Mia turned toward the noise, her breath catching. Through the broken glass, a silver sports car stopped in the gravel. The door opened, and Charles stepped out. No suit, no mask of power, just a man looking smaller than the world he'd built. His eyes found hers instantly, filled with something raw and human. For the first time, he looked like a student again. "Mia," he said, his voice barely more than breath. She didn't move. The silence between them was thick with unfinished stories. He took a cautious step forward, his shoes crunching against glass and gravel. "You're Andre's daughter." It wasn't a question. Mia nodded slowly. "And you were his pupil." The air between them seemed to hum with the past, two lives spiraling back toward a single truth. Charles swallowed hard, the memory of her father's voice echoing in his chest. "He told me once," he said, his tone breaking slightly, "that pride destroys what love builds. I didn't understand him then." His gaze dropped. "But I think I do now." Mia's expression softened, though her eyes stayed guarded. "You made him proud once," she said quietly, "but you made him sad too, because he saw what the world would turn you into." The words hit him with gentle precision, no venom, just truth. The wind moved through the open door of the workshop, carrying with it the scent of sea and metal. Charles looked up, his eyes meeting hers again. "Let me make it right," he said. "Not with words, with actions." Mia studied him for a long time, her silence neither forgiveness nor refusal, only the weight of choice. Then she turned toward the door, her father's initials glinting behind her. "If you mean it," she said, "then meet me where it all began." As she stepped out into the light, the ocean roared below the cliffs. Charles followed her with his gaze, his reflection fractured in the broken glass. Somewhere deep within him, pride gave its final breath, and something far greater began to stir. The day of the confrontation dawned grey, a heavy mist rising over the circuit as though the sea itself wanted to hide what was about to unfold. The grandstands were empty, the flags motionless, the track slick from the night's dew. Mia stood near the pit lane, her father's helmet in her hands, staring down at the thin white line that marked the start. It looked less like a boundary now, and more like a memory etched in asphalt. Every sound, the echo of waves, the creak of steel, felt amplified by the weight of what she knew must come next. Charles arrived without an entourage, without the armor of arrogance that usually followed him like a shadow. He stepped out of his car wearing simple clothes, no watch, no expensive cufflinks, no disguise. The silence between them was a living thing, stretching taut across the track. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fog clung to their outlines like ghosts reluctant to let go. Then, with a voice stripped of its usual certainty, he said, "You wanted me to meet you where it began. I'm here." Mia's gaze lifted, calm and unwavering. "I didn't bring you here to punish you," she said softly. "I brought you here to listen, maybe for the first time in your life." Her words didn't carry anger. They carried quiet authority, the kind her father once used to steady an impatient student. Charles nodded faintly, lowering his eyes. "Then I'll listen." His voice cracked slightly, and the sound of it made the wind pause. She walked slowly toward the car he'd brought, a sleek black model, polished but unfamiliar. Her reflection appeared and disappeared along its curves as she moved. "You built an empire on engines," she said, "but forgot what they were made for, not for pride, not for applause, for connection, for precision, for respect." Her fingers brushed the hood lightly, like a gesture of mourning. "My father taught you that, but you stopped hearing him long before he stopped speaking." Charles took a deep breath, his chest tightening. "I did," he admitted, "and I've thought about that every day since I saw that video. Watching you drive was like seeing him again. Every turn, every correction, every ounce of restraint. You didn't just remind me of him, Mia. You shamed me, in the best possible way." His words trembled at the edges, half confession, half plea. Mia set the helmet down gently on the pit wall. "Then why did you laugh?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Why make a mockery of something sacred? You saw a uniform and thought it defined me. You saw hands that served and forgot they once steered." She stepped closer now, her eyes steady on his. "You didn't just humiliate a maid, Charles. You humiliated the man who taught you honor." The fog around them thickened, heavy with unshed emotion. He met her gaze at last, his face bare of defense. "Because I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid that humility meant weakness. Afraid that if I ever looked down, I'd never stand tall again." His confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. "But when I saw you drive, I realized humility isn't the opposite of strength. It's the source of it." The truth fell from his lips like metal striking stone, loud in its simplicity. Mia said nothing at first. The only sound was the faint hum of the ocean beyond the circuit. She looked down at the track, tracing its curve with her eyes, as if seeing her life mapped before her. Loss, silence, rediscovery. When she finally spoke, her tone had softened. "My father always believed people could return to what was real," she said, "but only if they stopped running from what they broke." She turned back to him. "Are you ready to stop running?" Charles stepped forward, the mist curling around his silhouette. "Yes," he said, "if you'll let me prove it." Mia studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity beneath the ruin of his pride. What she saw wasn't perfection. It was a man stripped bare of pretense. That, more than apology, was enough. She nodded toward the car. "Then show me." He followed her gaze, understanding dawning slowly. "You want me to drive?" he asked. She smiled faintly, the first real warmth between them. "No," she said, "I want you to learn again." She tossed him the keys, and the metallic sound rang through the morning air like a challenge and a benediction all at once. The engine roared to life, but this time the sound didn't belong to pride or power. It belonged to redemption, beginning its first lap. The sun began to break through the fog as Charles slid into the driver's seat, the leather cold beneath his hands. The track shimmered ahead, a mirror of wet asphalt stretching into the mist. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful behind a wheel. He felt small. Every memory of victory, every headline and applause, seemed hollow compared to the quiet weight of Mia's eyes watching from the pit wall. This wasn't a race for speed, it was a race for truth. He turned the key, and the engine came alive, its growl low and uncertain, like a beast awakening from a long, uneasy sleep. The sound reverberated across the empty stands, echoing back fragments of the past. Mia stood still, her father's helmet in her hands, the sunlight glinting off its surface. It was almost as if the old man's presence lingered in the air, invisible yet guiding. For the first time, Charles understood. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about balance. He pressed the accelerator, feeling the power surge beneath him, but it didn't thrill him like before. Instead, it humbled him. The car responded to his every breath, not his ego. Each turn felt like a confession whispered into the curve of the track. I was wrong. I forgot who I was. I lost what mattered. Mia watched quietly, reading the sincerity not in his words, but in the restraint of his movements. Halfway through the circuit, A thin patch of water sent the tires skidding. The car spun violently, the world turning into a blur of silver and sky. Mia gasped, her heart freezing mid-beat. The car slid sideways, the tires screaming before stopping inches from the barrier. Smoke rose in thin curls from the hood. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mia didn't think. She ran. The helmet clattered against the concrete as she sprinted toward him, her voice breaking through the air. "Charles!" When she reached the car, she found him slumped forward, breathing hard but unhurt. His hands trembled against the steering wheel. For a man who'd lived his life untouchable, that small moment of fragility said more than any apology. She opened the door and reached out a hand. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're all right." He looked up at her, eyes wide, chest heaving. The arrogance that once lived in those eyes was gone, burned out by fear and revelation. Without hesitation, he took her hand. Their fingers met. Grease, tears, and understanding mingled together. The crowdless arena bore witness to a moment no trophy could ever honor. She helped him out of the car, steadying him as he caught his breath. "You stopped," she said softly. "Most men like you would have kept going." Charles nodded, voice rough. "I used to think stopping meant losing, but I think maybe it means learning." The simplicity of the statement carried the weight of a lifetime's undoing. Mia smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes glistening. "Then you've already won." They stood there in silence, surrounded by the faint hiss of cooling metal and the cry of distant gulls. The air felt lighter now, the fog thinning, the sun warm against their faces. Charles glanced toward the car, his symbol of status now reduced to a lesson in humility. "I spent years trying to conquer machines," he said quietly. "But all they ever asked was that I respect them." Mia nodded. "And the people who guide them." For a moment she placed her father's helmet in his hands. He held it reverently, as though touching something holy. "He believed in you," she said, "even after you left. He told me once that you'd only lost your way, not your soul." Charles blinked rapidly, his voice catching. "Then maybe this was his way of bringing us both back to the road." He smiled, small, real, unguarded. Mia stepped back, her gaze soft but certain. "Maybe redemption doesn't need a finish line," she said. "Just someone willing to stop long enough to see where it began." The wind picked up, carrying the words across the circuit. Charles nodded, looking toward the horizon, where the track met the sea, endless and bright. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a victory. He was looking for grace. From somewhere beyond the stands, the echo of an approaching crowd rose faintly. Reporters, cameras, the world closing in. But this time, Mia didn't flinch. She simply whispered, "Let them see who you've become." The next morning, Monaco awoke to headlines not of scandal, but of awe. "Billionaire admits his mistake. Honors unknown. Racer in public redemption." The photograph beneath it captured a moment no one had expected. Charles and Mia standing side by side at the edge of the track, her father's helmet between them. The world saw two figures once divided by power, now united by something quieter, rarer, respect. The noise of gossip had turned into silence, the kind born from collective wonder. The track was filled again, not with spectators seeking spectacle, but with people drawn by curiosity and grace. Mechanics, journalists, and old racers gathered in still disbelief. Charles walked the length of the pit lane without bodyguards, without cameras chasing his every move. When he stopped beside Mia, the murmurs softened into reverence. "I owe this woman an apology," he said, voice steady but full of weight. "Not in private, in truth." Mia stood beside him, her hands clasped gently before her, her expression composed yet human. She didn't bask in the attention, nor shrink from it. When Charles turned toward her, he lowered his head, not in showmanship but humility. "I mocked what I couldn't understand," he said. "I confused servitude with weakness and pride with strength. But strength," he paused, voice breaking slightly, "was standing before me all along." The wind carried the words like confession and benediction at once. Applause broke, soft and hesitant at first, then growing into something steady and genuine. For the first time, it wasn't for him, and he didn't mind. Reporters angled their cameras, but neither looked at them. Mia stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his arm. "We all forget who we are sometimes," she said softly, "but life has its ways of reminding us." It wasn't forgiveness spoken aloud, it was forgiveness lived. Renee appeared among the crowd, a quiet smile spreading beneath his weathered face. He nodded once toward Mia, pride glimmering in his tired eyes. "You drove more than a car," he whispered when he reached her. "You drove a man back to himself." She smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes warm with gratitude. For once, she felt her father would have approved of the silence she chose instead of anger. As the ceremony concluded, Charles turned to the crowd. "I will dedicate a new foundation," he announced, "in honor of André Laurent and his daughter, who reminded me that true mastery begins in humility." The applause that followed was different this time. It carried weight, like the sound of walls falling and doors opening. Even the sea beyond the track seemed to listen, its waves rhythmic and approving. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the sun dipped low over the Mediterranean, Mia and Charles remained on the empty circuit. The air smelled of oil and salt, familiar and clean. They stood in the golden quiet of evening, the world finally distant. "Do you think he'd forgive me?" Charles asked, his voice trembling, his gaze on the horizon. Mia looked at him, thoughtful. "He already has," she said. "The track wouldn't have let you drive again if he hadn't." A soft laugh escaped him, light and broken. "I never believed in signs," he murmured. "But last night when I spun out, I thought I saw him, just for a second." Mia's smile was gentle, touched by the sadness only peace can bring. "You didn't see him, Charles. You felt him." That's how love works. It never really leaves. It just changes lanes. They walked together down the length of the track, their shadows stretching long behind them. The light turned amber, and the sound of the sea blended with the wind's soft hum. For a while, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Between them, silence had finally stopped being a wound. It had become understanding. At the final turn, Mia stopped and placed her hand over the starting line, the same line where it had all begun. "It's strange," she whispered, "how the same place can be both an ending and a beginning." Charles knelt beside her, his hand resting beside hers. "Then let's make sure we start right this time." The last of the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and violet, a promise written in light. As the lights of Monaco began to flicker to life, Charles looked at her and said quietly, "Mia, there's one more thing I need to ask you." Weeks passed and the noise around their story began to fade, leaving behind something softer: legacy. The foundation launched quietly but powerfully, offering scholarships for young drivers who, like Mia once had, carried dreams bigger than their circumstances. Its name read simply, "The Laurent Initiative for Hope." Every letter was a promise, not of luxury but of second chances. Mia divided her time between the academy and the sea. The new circuit, rebuilt over the ruins of her father's, was alive again with the laughter of children learning to race, their small helmets gleaming under the sun. Each time she heard an engine start, she smiled. It no longer hurt to remember, it healed. The sound that once broke her now carried her forward. Charles kept his word. He sold one of his race teams, redirecting the funds to the foundation. The man who once measured worth in trophies had learned to measure it in lives changed. He still drove sometimes, but slower now, with reverence instead of vanity. "It's strange," he told Mia one afternoon, "how speed used to make me feel powerful. Now it just makes me grateful." Their connection deepened quietly, without spectacle. It wasn't romance born of glamour, but of shared understanding. Two wounded souls who had walked through fire and found peace on the same road. They didn't need grand gestures. Their presence was enough. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as a gentle gear shift, smooth, inevitable, true. One evening, as the sun set over the reopened track, Charles placed the old helmet in Mia's hands. Its paint was restored, the visor polished, but her father's name remained untouched. "He'd be proud," he said softly. Mia looked at the reflection of the sky on the visor, gold fading into blue, and whispered, "He'd be proud of you too." The wind carried the words like a prayer answered. Later, in the quiet of twilight, they sat side by side on the pit wall, watching the world settle into calm. "Do you ever think," Charles asked, "that maybe redemption is just learning to see people as they are, not as we need them to be?" Mia turned to him, her eyes warm with that quiet strength he'd learned to respect. "Yes," she said, "and love is what happens when we finally do." In time, they married in a small chapel near the sea. No press, no spectacle, only a handful of friends and the sound of waves against the rocks. Mia wore no jewels, only her father's old racing pin at her chest. When the ceremony ended, Charles didn't kiss her with triumph, but with reverence. It wasn't a beginning nor an end. It was an arrival. Afterward, they returned to the academy, where a new group of students waited at the gates. Children, mechanics, dreamers, each with something to prove, yet already enough as they were. Mia smiled at them, seeing her younger self in every wide-eyed glance. "The track is yours," she said. "Drive it like you mean it." Then, and for the first time, her father's legacy felt complete. The camera of time pulled back, the track stretching toward the horizon, the sea glittering beside it, the laughter of new racers rising into the air. Charles and Mia stood hand in hand at the edge, two silhouettes joined not by wealth or pride, but by faith in the goodness they'd fought to rediscover. The world kept moving, but they had already arrived where they were meant to be. As the light faded, the screen could almost whisper their lesson. We are all drivers on the same road. Some learn through victory, others through forgiveness, but only those who forgive truly reach the finish line. If this story touched your heart, click on the screen to watch the next film, another story of redemption, courage, and the quiet power of kindness.